I work for the blog section of a local newspaper, and being new and young, I often get sent out on crappy assignments. My top pieces involve interviews with poodle groomers, sewage plant managers, and our local clown. Yeah. Quitting's not really an option in this job market, so I've stuck it out. My manager has noticed my dedication, I suppose, so he threw me a bone today. I was sent to interview a man who residents had seen being taken into the police station in handcuffs. The only thing the concerned citizens knew for sure was that he was a stranger, and he was splattered in blood. The police weren't talking. On my way over there, I thought I'd finally gotten my foot in the door. This was a wild card. It could be nothing, or I could end up famous overnight. I was genuinely excited. Now I was just shaken and distressed. "Hey, aren't you Rob's kid?" a vaguely familiar policeman asked as I entered the lobby of their decently sized station. I shook off the torrential rain still dripping from my hair and nodded. Constant recognition was one of the weird benefits of returning to my small town after college. Yep, I'm here on behalf of the dispatch to interview the man that was just brought in. His chubby jolliness faded into grim distaste. He paused a full 5 seconds before finally replying. "I don't think a good kid like you needs to be talking to that guy." I politely began the spiel my manager had given me, even as I got my writing materials out of my pack. It was important to look as if I was proceeding despite the refusal. I didn't actually know if I was legally allowed in, but I acted like I was. "Well, it's my job, and he has the right to visitors, so..." Yeah, he said flatly, cutting me off with an understanding sigh. "Just don't let him get to you." He led me back through a couple dingy hallways. The back held the temporary cells, and he unlocked the first gate. "Grayson's in the last cell. I'll wait here." Okay. I entered by myself, moving past a series of gated cells. The last contained the only person in lockup. His once decent business wear was splattered in blood, yes, but he was not at all the image of violence I'd imagined. Tall, lanky, and topped by thinning blonde hair, he looked every bit an average businessman. If he'd had glasses, he might have been an exact match for one of my professors back at the university. For a moment, I felt let down. It didn't seem likely that there would be any sort of incredible story here, just some sort of mix-up. That feeling lasted only until he began speaking. He saw my media badge and my pen and paper and sighed with resignation.
"I suppose you want my story." "Yeah, I thought so. After much consideration, I do think that I should tell somebody what happened. I'm aware of how it sounds, so I've mostly shut up until now, but I'll tell you what I haven't told the police. That'll satisfy my ethical obligation. It's the least required and the most I'm willing to do because of the social risk. You'll believe me. You're young and look sharp, but most won't. I have no intention of ending up in an institution." "Don't smile. I'm serious." "Thank you. Now, I do have to say that this all began quite some time ago. I was young then, younger than you. The memories came back to me with the fog of very early youth, likely preteen. They were nightmares, you see. They haunted me for nearly a year. It was a thing, and my mother and father tried their best to find treatment for me. The nightmares went away only after I briefly joined the church, but I still chalk that up to coincidence. The religion thing is a whole other debate I've no energy to get into. It's 30 years later, give or take. I'm driving cross-country on business with my partner. What business am I in? It's not relevant to what happened. Smith and I were driving cross-country when we stopped at a dilapidated motel right outside a small town. We'd seen absolutely nothing but Midwestern farm fields for hours, so we took a walk into town to get some beer. Glenworth Heights. Could have been any other town. Looked like a million others and looked like yours. But as I walked into this town, you see, this is why I mention my childhood nightmares. I had the oddest sensation of déjà vu. Standing on that short main street, I felt like I recognized that particular pattern of storefronts. 45 people. That's what the sign said. Glen Heights, population 45. It was a stopover on the way from somewhere to somewhere else and nothing more. But I'd seen those buildings before, cast in another light and another context. I'd seen them in a nightmare. I'd seen the sky bleeding. I'd seen these buildings rotting. Their inhabitants had dwelled within, maimed, misshapen, mutated. Smith had a good sense for when I was spooked. I remained tense, but tried to shrug off the strange feeling and allay his concerns. Whatever mask of calm I managed to put on, it certainly fell away as we entered the liquor store. I called to mind the clerk's face before I'd gone inside. I told myself that he couldn't possibly be in there. I'd had a nightmare over 30 years ago about a 20-something hippie type whose facial skin had been carefully excised in front of me by steaming hooks. In that dream world, his bleeding cheek and jaw muscles had been exposed to the air, but he continued working the front under threat of even worse torture at the hands of the store's owner, who had become some sort of hissing, acidic monstrosity that lurked in the back room. His hooked limbs dripped acid and, Lord, I can't even describe. Forgive me. I just need a moment. Alright, where was I? The clerk. I called his face to mind, keeping it firmly in my mental view, and I was greeted with that exact face as I entered the store. I couldn't help but stare. Perhaps I'd been to this town as a child on some sort of family road trip, and perhaps I might have had nightmares about it later, but how could I have dreamed 30 years ago about a clerk that was here now? The store owner lurked in the back room, a thuggish man in a yellowed white shirt who lounged near a fan. I left the store immediately, and Smith knew something was up. He began to get belligerent. I assured him everything was fine. He knew I needed the money from our business trip to pay off my shrewd ex-wife's onerous child support line. I wasn't going to welch. But there was another concern on my mind. I'd stumbled into a waking link to my childhood nightmares, and those nightmares had held a distinct threat. The town in my dreams hadn't simply been horrible for surreal reasons. No, a gaping fissure in the earth had opened somewhere nearby. Though that vast searing crevice as a child, I'd witnessed people clawing at burning air from rivers of torturous bile, blinding crimson and azure flames that kept thousands perpetually cooking alive, and the screams. Don't frown with disbelief. It was just a nightmare. It was a metaphor, right? For fear, for pain, for change. The townspeople had all changed, and then marched to the gap to worship it, widen it, and bring through demons untold. It was just a dream. Except that I'd dreamed the location of the fissure. Smith was suspicious of me, so I couldn't ditch him, but I made up a story about checking for money I'd left behind on a previous business trip. We walked out into the sparse woods behind the town, and Smith kept his hand near the gun, but I was far more worried about encountering that hellish rift. I was enormously relieved to find an empty forest glen, and then subtly chilled to realize that I remembered the lay of the jumbled rocks, swaying grasses, and towering trees. I'd seen this place. In a veritable trance, I wandered out into the high grasses. Once I was out in the center, I began to notice that the assembled rocks were strewn about in a pattern that was anything but random. It was a vast circle, and I was within. Bending down, I even found the specific rocks I remember seeing split apart before they'd begun belching flames. Runes. There were runes in the rocks, ancient runes in a style that looked Native American, or something even older. Smith grinned near me, then, as I touched the rocks. He'd figured that I'd found the spot where I'd stashed my supposed cash. He'd also figured, since I was far superior to his usual class of partners, that I must have had quite the sum hidden there. He didn't figure that I was also smarter than his usual spick partners. I lifted one of the rune rocks and, well, his skull caved in. He was dead instantly. No, this blood on my shirt isn't from hitting him with a rock, and that's not why they brought me in. That act was self-defense, and I'll prove that in a court of law, or I'll at least get the jury to understand. A dead thug and a living, well-mannered white man like myself, I'm not worried about it. Don't make that face. I'm just being honest. But no, this isn't that blood on my shirt, because the blood from that impact shot to the earth like it'd been pulled down by strange gravities. In fact, the red liquid spurted out of his head wound like a fountain, arcing right down to those ruined rocks before me and disappearing between. It wasn't nearly all of the blood in his body, but it was enough to be surprising. The rest soaked his clothes and the surrounding ground. Was it simply a nearby death that had reawakened latent energies? Or perhaps I'd accidentally reenacted some ancient ritual. In any case, I found myself standing in exactly the spot I dreamed 30 years before, watching that exact nightmare unfold. The ground splitting, flames erupting, and fiery heat radiating against my face as the screams of countless damned souls erupted into the real world. Yes, I'm serious. No, I'm not crazy. I'm completely sane, and that's why I ran. What sane person would have stayed in such a place? Hell itself had partially erupted into a half-mile-wide glen in the forest, some ancient ritual site. I ran back to town, intent on getting our car. I'd had the remaining sense, despite my panic, to grab the keys from Smith's pocket. But I did need something to calm my nerves. My hands shook violently. I knew I wasn't going to be able to drive, so I entered the town drugstore. I already knew the little old lady within. Her warm smile rang true against my surreal childhood memories. Her doddering husband worked the cash register while she picked out what I'd asked for, and I shuddered. In my dream, the old woman's skull had split open, and her brain had grown teeth, forming a fleshy maw big enough to crush and eat her terrified husband's face. He died gurgling and betrayed by his lifelong love, and then his corpse had begun turning itself inside out, growing 1,000 little spider-like limbs from the inner edges of his skin and muscles. The resulting corpse thing had chased my terrified child self down the main street relentlessly, and my only escape had been waking in a screaming sweat. I remember him saying this yesterday, syllable for syllable. "What are you looking at?" He was asking out of kindness and confusion. He wasn't angry that I'd been staring at him while lost in memory. He was just worried about me, right up until the teeth slammed down and his face crumpled between brain matter jaws. Leaping back and knocking over product-filled shelves, I screamed in absolute terror. Who wouldn't? The old woman had become exactly what I... God, it was sickening. Not waiting for his corpse to animate, I ran, surrounded by blurry panic. The sky was beginning to bubble right over the town, even approaching a boil. It looked like a rapidly building normal storm, not yet blood like I dreamed, but I was no fool. There were screams echoing out up and down the street, not the screams of the damned, but the screams of the living. Those unfortunate souls who hadn't yet turned, being slaughtered by their friends and loved ones. I wasn't changing. Why wasn't I changing? Had my presence at the ritual site protected me? Or was it the fact that these people had lived nearby the site their entire lives? Were they more susceptible somehow? On my desperate run back to the motel and to my car, I almost bowled over a startled old man who had been heading into town. His skin was mottled, and he was very frail. He gripped my arm with surprising strength, though, and screamed at me to be heard over the raging winds. He said, "What have you done, boy? I saw you. What did you do out in the woods? Did you disturb the stone ring?" My horrified stare was all the confirmation he needed. He said, "The ring is a barely cracked seal, and the plagued townsfolk are going to try to widen the crack, perhaps destroy the seal completely. I'm too old to do what must be done. You must either move whatever sacrifice you made and burn the corpse, or you must return to town and kill every single one of the monsters those people have become.
I stared at Grayson, my mouth dropped a half-inch. Holy shit! Had this guy gone on a killing spree? I mean, I would have too if that had all really happened to me. So, the blood on your shirt, you killed all those people? He looked at me as if I was a moron.
Do I look like some spick enforcer? I've never fought a man in my life. Kill 40-odd horrible mutated monsters all by myself? No, that would have never worked.
I see. So he'd gone back and moved Smith's body. That explained the blood on his shirt. Did that mean that there was still a small town populated by mutated horrors out there? Or had closing the rifts destroyed or dispelled them somehow?
All right, I've told you what happened,
he said plainly.
Any ethical obligation I had is now satisfied. It's on you.
Shivering with confusion, I gave some polite goodbye and walked out in a daze. The cop who had let me in nodded as he saw my face. Guy's a real prick, huh? What do you mean? I asked, knowing that he hadn't been told Grayson's story. He was going over 100 down the highway in a car filled with drugs and hit some housewife's van, he said, leading me back toward the front. Killed 3 kids. Ah, I had thought at first, other than shock. How shitty could one person be? He had children he'd walked out on. He was involved in crime. He was vaguely racist. At least he'd gone back and... Wait, so he got blood on his shirt from the car accident? Yeah, the cop replied. What'd you think it was? I froze right at the front door to the station. Outside, torrential rains beat down on the glass. Among all his other faults, Grayson was also a coward. He hadn't gone back. He just walked away. He'd been warned by decades-old dreams. He'd been led to the place and time of a tremendous disaster with knowledge of what was to come, and instead of becoming a hero, he'd screwed it all up and walked away? Was that the true nature of human beings then? How many scary stories had I heard in my lifetime, expecting with each tale that I would rise to the occasion if they ever happened to me? Here I was, also doing nothing about it. What was there to do except stare out the window? I had no proof. If I did, I might have been able to call for aid or go there myself and try to, as Grayson had put it, kill 40-odd mutated monsters all by myself. The thought made me quaver, and I kept finding reasons not to go and check it out for myself. Was I a coward too? I didn't want to believe him, but there was such an odd feeling in the air. So much for rising to the occasion. I had no proof. The story of the century, my first big break and possibly my last, would likely be believed by no one. There's nothing left to do now but post it online and hope. Hope that someone does something, or hope that Grayson was lying. God. After that, I'll watch the uncommonly intense rain and pray to God that it doesn't turn red.